everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Jax and today I'll be showing you how to paint fur. So anyone who's been watching this channel for a while know that animals, creatures, things with fur make up the bulk of what I like to draw. Now, I'm not a realism artist, I don't paint animals to look exactly like their real life counterparts, so in this tutorial we'll be exploring more of a stylistic rendering of fur. Now, this is the piece that I'll be using to demonstrate the fur painting techniques. Now, like most of the art on my channel, this is a commissioned piece, and I just thought it would be the perfect character for this tutorial because we have this nice variety of fur lengths across the character. So the fur on the face is a little shorter, and then towards the cheek and the neck, it gets a little longer and thicker. Anyway, so I thought this would just be a great opportunity to show you guys a few different methods to paint different textures of fur. Anyway, before we get stuck into the fur, we first need to block in the general colors and backgrounds in the character. As you can see, I've already done that here, but I'm going to show you a quick time lapse of me doing this. So basically what I did was I filled in the background with a darkish color and then used the gradient tool to make some dark and light adjustments. And then for the character, I take a flat brush and just quickly paint in the general colors. I first pick colors from the reference, but then I usually adjust it a bit to blend in with the overall tone of the background. For the shadows, I like to make a layer on top of the base colors, clip it to the layer underneath, and then set the layer to multiply. I then usually choose a light, cool toned color, keeping in mind the environment the character is in, and I start blocking in the shadows. So for this piece, I wanted the light to come in from the top right corner, so I lay in the shadows with that in mind. Next up, I create another clipping layer on top of the shadow layer, and I set this one to overlay. Now, to complement the cool shadows, I really wanted a nice warm light coming in from the top, so I selected a light gold color and started sweeping that in. I also then like to play around a bit with the hue and saturation settings, just until I get the right look and tone that I'm going for. Finally, I took a bit of time to place in the markings and also make a few light blotches for where the plants and flowers in this piece were going to be. So once all that's done, this is what the piece looks like with all the general colors placed down. I've merged all the layers now as well, so the character is on her own single layer. I also have the layers with the rough environment blotted in, but I'm going to keep those turned off for now since we want to focus on the painting of the fur. So firstly, I'm going to show you some of the brushes I like to use for fur and the settings I have them on. And all of these can be downloaded from the Medibang cloud. And if you don't know how to do that, I have a super helpful video explaining how to access the cloud and all the new features you get when you do, including all the brushes I'm going to use here. So firstly, we have a flat brush with a wide end. Just going to turn up the ease of mixing of colors up, and then I'm just going to turn down the load color, just down a bit. And what this does is it makes the color go on a little less strongly, and when it's applied to color on the same layer, it actually blends in more of the color rather than putting them down on full opacity. So that's brush number one. Brush number two is basically the exact same brush, but what I've done is I've double tapped it and I've turned down the min width to pretty much 0%. You can make it a bit higher, but around that width. Press OK, and then instead we're going to reverse the mixing of colors and low color options. So the low color is now higher, and the ease of mixing color is just actually maybe set that about halfway. So what this does is it gives you a nice pointed, sharp edge, which you can make nice, crisp lines with. There we go. So yeah. Okay, and next up we have flat brush dry, and this is one I actually just discovered quite recently. I actually didn't have this in my usual repertoire for most of my older paintings, but it is actually a really, really nice, slightly textured brush. You can see the individual bristles, and basically I just have one, and I have the width set on a relatively high minimum width. Press OK, and there we have nice soft brush that we can add some texture to the fur to. Okay, and finally we have this one. This is the fur texture that I quite like using, and this is one that I've downloaded online. So again, if you watched the videos I linked before about getting more brushes in Medibang, there's a link in that video and also in the description for this video below of where you can download this brush. And it's quite like the flat brush dry, but it just has slightly larger bristles, slightly more crisp, slightly more harsh. So those are the 4 basic brushes that I'll be using for the fur painting. Okay, so one of the first things I like to do when I'm painting fur is just to gently sketch out where the clumps of fur are going to be. So here we're going to have longer strands of fur on the tiger's cheeks and also along the neck. So I'm just going to lightly sketch in some lines just to indicate where these longer clumps of fur are going to fall. Now, things to keep in mind when doing this, you want to know where the general direction of the fur of the animal is going in. So you don't want the fur just flying off everywhere. So in this case, fur is falling quite flat towards the body. So I'm just going to sketch them in a nice downward motion. Okay, just very lightly, very general. This will just give you some nice broad guidelines so you don't get lost whilst you're painting. So now I'm going to take the same brush, so I'm using the flat wet brush here. Just going to pick one of the slightly darker colors, and then I'm just going to stroke in some shadows just below where the tips of the clumps of fur are going to be. Just like lightly stroke them in. There we go. Okay, so now I'm just going to take the flat dry brush, just going to softly blend that in a bit more, just so we don't have harsh painted looking lines. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take one of the sharper tipped brushes and we're just going to start painting in individual tufts of fur. So pick a nice, relatively lighter color in comparison to the shadows that you put in, and just turn down the ease of mixing a bit, and just start gently putting in fur-shaped blocks of color. Okay, and here's a trick. Once you do that, you just want to take the flatter edge brush and just blend those fur clumps in, just like that. And then go for the thinner edge brush and just define those clumps of fur just a little bit. Just make a nice shadow just to contrast with the tuft of fur. To explain this process in a nutshell, essentially we're laying down the shadows first before going in with lighter colors to create the individual sections of fur and blending them in with the colors in between the highlights and the shadows. Since we don't have a brush that can directly create nice sharp opaque tips and then subsequently become wider and blend in with the base color, we have to do this manually with a sharp flat brush and then use wider edge brushes to blend in a sharp stroke. And yes, this is quite a tedious process, especially when you have large bodies of fur to cover. But texturing anything in general requires a lot of time and patience. Luckily, this technique is very simple and very easy to master. A couple of shortcuts I find very useful. Firstly, of course, is Ctrl-Z, the undo option. You'll notice that I use it quite a lot when I paint, and unapologetically so. I always never get the shape or stroke I want the first time round, so I keep undoing it until I do. Another really useful shortcut I have set is the Alt key. When I hold down the Alt key, the brush tool becomes a color picker, and I use this to pick the in-between colors I use when blending, and also when applying new tufts of fur. Occasionally the color I need won't be an existing color in the image. Sometimes I need a lighter or darker color, in which case I usually start out by picking an existing color, and then moving the slider in the color wheel a little higher or lower depending on what I need. I like to make the tip of each tuft of fur the brightest to contrast with the shadow underneath, and the base of the tuft becomes darker as it blends in with the shadow of the fur above it. Because of this, one good idea is to start from the bottom upwards. Fur higher up on the animal's body tends to slightly layer on top and cover the fur underneath. By working from the bottom up, you don't need to blend every single tuft of fur in perfectly because you can just cover the base with the fur on top. Now, I didn't do that here because I lack insight, but that's absolutely fine as well. It just means when you work on the lower layer, you have to be careful not to paint over the tuft you've already painted. Alright, now that you know the general technique of painting tufts of fur, there are a few additional things to keep in mind to make them look right. Remember, fur is a three-dimensional texture that is attached through a three-dimensional body. Now, I'm not the best when it comes to accurately representing anatomy, but I know the neck of the animal isn't just a cylinder, it has curves and muscles. In the case of tigers, like this one, they tend to have pretty wide necks. And here she's also turning towards the right as well. So the fur attached also needs to shift slightly in the direction the head is facing. Never be afraid to look up references when trying to figure out where the fur is supposed to fall. They're there to help, and it's really going to help improve your art and make the fur look more realistic. So that's it for long fur. Now I'm just going to time lapse through me painting through the rest of the neck and chest. One of the final touches I liked to do for long fur is to take a small sharp brush and then just draw in a few individual strands of hair coming off the larger tufts. The long fur on the neck is done, I'm going to show you how I like to paint the smaller, shorter furs on the face. And if you wanted, you could use the same technique I showed you with the long fur, but just reduce the size of the individual tufts. But that will take forever to finish. In my opinion, with short fur, using a textured brush like the fur brush or the dry flat brush I showed you earlier to quickly paint on and give the impression of a fur texture. I'm going to use the same technique as before where I paint on the shadowed areas first, and then I'm going to take a lighter color and then paint over those shadows to create areas of highlight. In terms of the brush settings, I like to keep the load color of the fur brush quite high because I want the fur texture to be quite visible. If the load color was too low and the ease of mixing too high, I would have a much harder time getting a nice textured fur look. Okay, so now I'm just going to do this all over the face and the same thing with the markings. Just letting the brush do all the work for me to create a simple short fur texture. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I'm going to do a time lapse again and I'll be back at the end of the video with the finished painting. Alright, so this is the finished painting. I put all the foreground plants and post-production sparklies in as well. I really hope this tutorial was helpful. This is generally how I like to paint fur at the moment. Sometimes I change things up a bit depending on how I'm feeling, but the basic technique remains. Shadows first and then tufts of highlighted fur on after. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know what tutorial you'll like to see next, and do follow me on all these other social media. I'm literally on every platform, so follow whichever ones are the most convenient ones for you. Links are all down in the description. So yeah, thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Bye!